So what about positive feedback? There are times when, in order to maintain homeostasis, the body will use positive feedback in the response to a changing variable. It turns out that most of the time, negative feedback is used. But there are a couple of examples of positive feedback that we can see in the human body. Now, what's different about positive feedback is that as a variable starts to change, again, as the stimulus, it will be reinforced to continue changing in the same direction until some climactic event occurs that will return the variable to its set point. Positive feedback is a really bizarre mechanism, right? As a variable starts to change in one direction or another, positive feedback reinforces that change. It keeps it going more and more and more until something happens, something climactic, that will cause it to stop changing and return to its set point within the normal range. Now, there are a couple of examples of positive feedback that I want us to be familiar with. One involves reproductive hormones, particularly estrogen and the process of ovulation. And the other involves the hormone called oxytocin and childbirth. At the bottom of the slide, you can see a drawing of what we would call the positive feedback cycle involving oxytocin during childbirth. This positive feedback cycle involves the head of the infant pressing down onto the cervix of the mother. This action, this pressing of the head down against the cervix, is a stimulus. We're seeing increased pressure. Pressure is the variable here. And pressure can be picked up by receptors in the cervix. That information, the increase in pressure on the cervix, gets sent along neural pathways to the control center, which is the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, once again. And what the hypothalamus is going to do is interpret that information and initiate a response. The response is going to involve a nearby gland called the pituitary gland, which is going to secrete a hormone called oxytocin. If you're not familiar, oxytocin is a hormone that stimulates uterine contractions, among other things. So the oxytocin will travel through the bloodstream down to the uterus, and it will cause the uterus to contract even harder. And what that's going to do is push the baby's head against the cervix even harder. The pressure against the cervix is going to go up. That information gets sent to the control center, the brain, in this case the hypothalamus. More oxytocin gets released. More oxytocin means more uterine contractions, which increases the pressure of the baby's head on the cervix. It goes around and around and around. Increased pressure generates more increased pressure, and the pressure goes up and up and up, slowly but surely causing that cervix to dilate. Now remember, in positive feedback, we're going to see the variable changing in the same direction until a climactic event occurs. In this case, the climactic event is birth. It's the passage of the infant through the cervix and out into the world. That's going to remove the pressure on the cervix, and the positive feedback loop will end. Pressure will return to its normal range, and the process will be done, will be completed. I've done the same thing on this slide that I did on the earlier slide. I've simply written it out in words: positive feedback and childbirth. The stimulus here is the increase in pressure on the cervix, the head of the baby pushing down against the cervix. This pressure can be received by a particular type of receptor called a mechanoreceptor. That receptor receives the information that the variable is changing and sends that information along neural pathways to the control center in the brain. In this case, the control center is the hypothalamus. It's going to integrate that information and initiate a response. The effector, in the case of positive feedback during childbirth, is this posterior pituitary gland, which is going to secrete the hormone oxytocin into the blood. The response occurs when the oxytocin stimulates the smooth muscle inside of the uterus to contract, pushing that baby's head down against the cervix. That's going to cause pressure, and even higher pressure against the cervix. Stimulus picked up by the mechanoreceptors, relayed to the hypothalamus, more oxytocin, more uterine contractions, more pressure. This is positive feedback. The response is going to keep the variable changing in the same direction. We call that reinforcing the change. It's going to keep getting higher and higher and higher until a climactic event occurs. And in that case, we've got the cervix opening and the baby delivered. Pressure will be removed from the cervix. The mechanoreceptors will stop sending information to the hypothalamus, will stop secreting oxytocin, the uterus will stop contracting, and the cycle ends. Before we finish today, there are a couple of important points I want to really reinforce with you. Remember, feedback mechanisms keep variables like body temperature within the normal range. Remember, this is all about homeostasis, maintaining a relatively stable equilibrium. As temperature goes up within the normal range, it's brought back down through negative feedback so that it stays in the normal range. It is true that sometimes variables exit the normal range despite these feedback mechanisms. In other words, sometimes the body is no longer in homeostasis. Until the cause of the variable leaving the normal range has been removed, feedback mechanisms will still engage, but they will essentially be ineffective, and the body will no longer be in homeostasis. A great example of this is fever. Fever, or what's more technically referred to as hyperthermia, brings the core body temperature outside of the normal range. In other words, out of homeostasis. Remember, we said normal body temperature for a human is between 97 and 99 Fahrenheit. Once it goes above 99, you now have a fever. You now have hyperthermia. Now, fever has a purpose, remember. Fever is part of our immune response to things like infections and inflammation. Fever has a purpose, and it will remain in place until it's no longer needed, essentially, until the immune system stops triggering the fever. At that point, core body temperature will return to the normal range. While you have hyperthermia, while a person has a fever, feedback mechanisms are still trying. They will activate, but they won't be effective. They won't return the core temperature back to normal range. The only thing that's going to get it back to normal range is the end of the immune response, the end of the fever. So it's important that you don't think of a fever as being what sets off negative feedback. Negative feedback is trying. It's trying when you have a fever. But once your body temperature leaves its normal range, you are no longer in homeostasis. You are no longer in that relatively stable equilibrium. Negative feedback mechanisms will try, though. So a person who has a fever will sweat, right? A person who has a fever will look very flushed because their blood vessels are dilating in their skin, trying to bring body temperature back down. But this isn't normal fluctuation. A fever is caused by the immune system for a reason. The opposite example is also true. Remember, when your core body temperature goes below 97, you now have what's called hypothermia. Hypothermia occurs when the core body temperature falls outside of the normal range, again, out of homeostasis. When a person is exposed to very extreme cold environmental temperatures, your core body temperature can fall out of its normal range, and it will stay out of its normal range until the cause is removed. In other words, until that person is brought into a warmer environment. Once again, negative feedback will try to bring it back into normal range, but it won't return it to normal range until that person is brought back into a warm environment. In other words, until the cause is removed. So these are examples when the body leaves homeostasis. What we've been talking about so far is how the body maintains homeostasis, how it keeps your core body temperature between 97 and 99 during a normal active day.